Well, last weekend, Paul Patterson thought I would be preaching, and so he was a little confused when he said, Jeb will be addressing the mothers for Mother's Day here in a minute, I'm sure. And I looked at him from the front row, and I shook my head, no, I won't. And I said, Levi will be. And he thought, how in the world is Jeb going to use the tribe of Levi to thank the mothers for Mother's Day? And, well, obviously that did not happen. This is what happens when people get a little, they have biblical names. Things get confusing up here, like Levi or Joshua or Malachi, if there's any Malachis. But I do want to say thank you to Levi for preaching on Mother's Day last weekend. Thank you so much for that lesson. It was on Elijah. But also, I do want to address the moms this morning as well. And so I wanted to get a chance to just say that moms have a hard job. And just talk a little bit about how sometimes their job, it can be thrilling, but it also can be exhausting for some of the things they have to do. Here's a list of just a few things they have to go through. You know that you are a mom when you've been used as a human Kleenex and didn't even bat an eye. When you use baby wipes to clean everything, no matter what it is. You hide in the pantry to eat a snack because you don't want to share it. You've bribed someone with candy to let you use the bathroom alone. When you can recite children's movies perfectly, but you can't remember what day of the week it is. If you've ever faked a sickness to get a quick nap. You consider permanent markers weapons of mass destruction. You are known by the name Mama, Mommy, Mom, or Mom, 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 Mom. And last but not least, you see a smear of brown on your shirt and you have to smell it to see if it's chocolate or poop, right? Because being a mom is hard, right? It can be thrilling, but it also can be very exhausting. And it reminds me of where we started out this year with the series that we were doing, Jesus is Greater, through the book of Hebrews. And it was written to a tired and weary group of Christians who were obviously Jewish in ethnicity, and so they probably came from Judaism, and they were thrilled at first to call Jesus Lord. They went from Judaism to Christianity, and they were thrilled that Jesus was their Lord. But now they're tired, they're weary of the persecution that's coming their way, and so they're ready to give up on faith in Jesus. And so Hebrews was written, the Hebrew author writes this sermon, and this sermon is all about how Christ is greater. So don't go back to that inferior religion of Judaism. He is greater than anything that you had before in that. He's greater than all of the things that you found in Judaism. He's greater than the angels. He's greater than Abraham. He's greater than Moses. He's a greater covenant, and he is a greater sacrifice. So don't give up on Jesus. And he's encouraging these tired Christians to keep on going. And then he takes some time in Hebrews chapter 11, where we've paused for the last couple of months and looked at some of the heroes of faith. That's what Levi preached on last week with Elijah. And he really tied that up nicely. And I'm going to mention one more today, but it is in connection to our overall series through Hebrews. So he takes this time to go through Hebrews chapter 11 to talk about these heroes of faith that persevered to the very end, to the bitter end, in faith. And it's in Hebrews 11:32. We'll start there. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, or Jephthah. Good job, Ernie, this morning with these names. I know that was hard. And David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, and they were raised to life again. And so the Hebrew audience hears these words, and they're like, well, that's good for them. Yes, that was encouraging. They had faith. Everything turned out awesome for them. They routed foreign armies. They became strong in their weakness. And yes, we remember the widow in Elijah who he stayed with. Her son died but was brought back to life. That was awesome. God was awesome in power then, and that is so encouraging. But we are here now. What are we going to get from these heroes of faith who have really succeeded? And so the Hebrew preacher continues his sermon on, and he writes these words: there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released, so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins. They were destitute. They were persecuted, and they were mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in the desert and in the mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith. Yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. I think if we're honest, none of us really wants to be in the there were others list. None of us really want to sign up for that community, do we? But the reality is that they were faithful too. So here's the big idea for today that I want you to get. You know, if you kind of don't take away anything else, try and remember this. And as you go throughout your faith walk, remember this: a faith that perseveres, it recognizes gain and pain are both commended faith. You see, this whole section of Hebrews 11 is about people who finished their race well. And so they persevered to the very, very end, and they finished their faith race. And the there were others list, they were commended just as much as the heroes of faith who were, in our minds and eyes, successful. In heaven, their faith stories are celebrated just as much as the others. And he says, these were all commended for their faith. And I just want to take a moment, just real quickly as we go through this, to say that I believe that we need to create space in our own church for both kind of faith testimonies. These stories of faith that people tell in our communities, we need to make room for stories of faith where they experienced great gain and success, and the stories of those whose journeys of faith brought them great, great pain. And sadly, I think in faith communities around, there are people that have an unbalanced view of what a healthy faith testimony is. And so this past week, I got to take a very long road trip with my son back from college. And so me and Liam, we drove all the way back near Oklahoma, and we're headed back this way. And, you know, we wanted to make sure to not just make it a road trip and only drive. We wanted to see a couple things. And so we got to, one of the things we're like, what do you like to see? What do I like to see? One of the things we both like to look and see is air museums. We both love air museums. And so on our road trip, we kind of made a little excursion through Utah to go see the Hill Air Museum there in Utah, the Hill Aerospace Museum. And one of the reasons why is because it was free. And so that's where we're going. So that was a good thing. But the other reason was we love airplanes. And so in this museum, there are 3 big, giant hangars of planes. Amazing, huge planes where many of these airplanes, they tell the stories of brave pilots who piloted them to success and victory over enemy air and over the skies. And they're amazing stories of success. And I noticed as I was looking around one of these three large hangars, in one of these three large hangars, I kind of saw beyond the planes, and there was this not very impressive but small exhibit. And it was dedicated to the POWs during the Vietnam War. Now, they went through torture, they went through pain and suffering after being captured, and I'll tell you, there were not a lot of people roaming around this section. They're mostly in the other plane section, right? But as I was looking at their stories, I read this placard, and I didn't take a picture, so I'm paraphrasing what I read, but it said essentially this. It said, these GIs fought a war too. They fought a war too. It was just a different kind of war. A war to survive. A war to keep information secret that they needed to stay secret. And to obey just enough to where they could survive but not compromise anyone else, one of their comrades or their character. Both of them fought wars. And they fought bravely. And it seems to me that in our communities of faith, that we need to make room for both kinds of faith as well. We need to make room for the high school student that goes to high school, they start a Bible study, and hundreds come to their Bible study. And we need to make room in our communities for the high school student that goes to high school and says, I was open with my faith and I've been ridiculed for most of my high school career. I think there needs to be room for the person who said, we prayed for a cure for the tumor to go away. We need to make room in our communities for the testimonies of faith that said, we prayed and the doctor said, there is no cure. Because in both instances, people finished their faith well. And they are commended in heaven as such. So these heroes of faith that we read about in the Bible doesn't hide that some of them were flawed, and the Bible doesn't hide that some of them were weary and tired. The Bible doesn't hide that some of them gained a better resurrection because their faith story looked more like pain than success and gain, right? So as we close out this series in the book of Hebrews and on the heroes of faith, the question is, how do we as Christians persevere in our faith, especially when we're tired and we're weary and it's looking more like a faith story of pain than it is of gain for us? How do we persevere? And the Hebrew author gives us, I say the word advice, that's probably not the right word, but he gives us counsel, he gives us teaching how to cure this weary faith and how to have a faith that lasts to the end. And it's a simple way. He says you need to get a greater focus. And so he goes on to say in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, and this will be our main focus text this morning. He says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand at the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So first of all, I think a greater focus means that we need to look at others, remembering past pioneers of faith. And we've spent quite a good amount of time talking about this, but maybe for those who are new and just as a refresher, all of us stand on the shoulders of people of faith who've gone on before us and finished their life of faith well. All of us stand on these people's shoulders. We all have received the baton of faith from people who inspire us to keep on going and who ran the race before us. And he says that we are surrounded by these clouds of witnesses. Now, I don't want to get too into this with people, but some people will say, well, that means people are watching us. I don't think so. I think that means that there is a cloud of people who are bearing witness through their life that we can look to, who have gone on before us, who are in Scripture in particular, because he says, therefore, right? He's talking about all these heroes of faith. They have gone on before us, and they bear witness to us with their lives that God will see us through. So you may have come across some Christians in your life or heard of some Christians who say, I don't read the Old Testament. I just need the New Testament. Jesus is good enough. That's all I need. I might take Proverbs or the Psalms, okay? I'll read those. But I don't need the Old Testament. I don't know if anybody's run across some people. I have. And I just want to say to them, you know, you are missing out on a treasure trove of godly examples of men and women in faith to inspire you and to help you keep going. One of my favorite stories is the story of Daniel and his three friends. Daniel's three friends, to me, they're Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They are the epitome of people who understand what it means to have faith that can have gain or have suffering and pain. They were slaves in Babylon, and they worked their ways up to the king of Babylon's to be his servants there in the palace. But they won't bow down to his idols. And so the king says, you can bow down to my idol, an image, or you can burn. What will it be? And this was their response. Check this out. I think it's so inspiring. I think it's so encouraging. It says this in Daniel chapter 3, verse 16. King Nebuchadnezzar, this is what they said. King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. And then look at these words. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. You see, they understood that God has the power to save us, but he doesn't have to for us to continue to have real faith in him, right? He doesn't have to, because we are still commended for our faith, whether we have gain or we have pain. God ended up rescuing them, spoiler alert, but we are still people of faith, even if God chose not to. And stories of these clouds of witnesses in the Bible, they inspire us. But so do stories of the cloud of witnesses that we have seen with our own eyes walk out and live out the life of faith before us. And so one more story about Paul Patterson. No, I didn't ask permission. I'm going to say it anyways. So just a couple of months ago, Paul gave a communion talk on a person in his life, a hero of faith of his, that helped show him the way to salvation and opened it up to him. It was a guy by the name of Gene Bannister. And he talked about Gene as being someone who was exemplary in his walk in faith and was instrumental in bringing Paul to faith. And he did this in March. And the reason I remember that it was March is because it was the week that our spring break retreat people were here from Harding University. And right there on the second row was a girl who was listening to Paul give this testimony about Gene Bannister. And as she's listening, she goes, that's the same Gene that is my grandfather. This girl from Arkansas was listening, and she had no idea that somebody from this pulpit would start talking about her hero of faith, Gene Bannister, who made and did so much for her in her life. And so as she listened, her eyes just started filling with tears, thinking about her grandfather, Gene Bannister. And I tell you that story to say, there are a cloud of witnesses for us to look to, yes, in Scripture, but there are a cloud of witnesses for us to look to who inspire us, who have been faithful in this life as well. And guess what? People are looking at you too. They're watching you. For me, in this congregation, there are a handful of couples that I look to, and I am looking at and watching their example of faith in God, their example of faith in how they treat their spouse, and really their example of faith and how they have loved the church. And there's people, some of them are watching online because they can't be here, but there are people in this church that I'm watching your life of faith. And I think that's why this next point is so important. See, we need to have a greater focus that looks at others, but we also need to have a greater focus that looks at ourselves to remove the pitfalls and to run this race with perseverance in faith. And so the reason that my throat is getting scratchy, would somebody please grab me a cup of water, or if you have a bottle of water? Oh, never mind, I got a Stanley here from my wife. Ooh, cooties. Thank you, sweetie. I apologize about that. So one of the reasons that Levi filled in for me last week is because every year I like to try and do a continued education, and we go to a place called Pepperdine University in Malibu, California. It's really hard to go there. This is talking about suffering, Malibu, California, to learn and glean from God's greatest teachers. That's really hard and difficult for us. But we were there at Pepperdine, and this is just an open invitation to everybody here. We want you all to come next year. Most of you. We need somebody here to preach and need somebody to listen. But I want most of you to come, whoever can come. We'd love to have you there. It's a great time. But I'll come back to that in just a second. So we're continuing on in Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 1. It says, "Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us." And as I read those words this past week, as I was going through this study, it reminded me of a session that I got to sit in at Harbor this couple weeks ago of a guy named Josh Ross. He's a minister in Tennessee, and he spoke about the topic of the character of Jesus, who he was as a person. And Josh told this story, and I believe he even quoted this verse, and he said, there are things that hinder our faith walk that are not sin, and things that hinder our faith walk that are sin. And so Josh said he did this meditation, and he went out to this place. I think it was in the desert. It's in this, house or hut that hermits and monks go to. And I guess a lot of ministers go there as well. And they just, for a week, they just pray. And it's in silence and solitude. And so he goes to have this meditation time of prayer. And he's meditating on this verse. And this verse is from Psalms chapter 139. And it says this. He prayed this prayer the whole time he was there. Pause for the cute baby. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way of everlasting. Without a show of hands, how many people can actually pray that prayer? So often when I'm about to preach about sin, the person that I'm most disappointed in as I work through the lesson is not you, but it's actually myself. That I will still struggle with sin in my own life. Even on good weeks, it is hard and difficult for me to pray this prayer of David. And so Josh is praying this prayer, and he sensed the Lord tell him or talk to him during this time at the very end of it. He said, I heard the Lord say something to this effect. You really don't know what you're asking me, but keep praying this prayer. In other words, if you start praying this prayer, the Lord will start bringing to mind some things that you know they are offensive to the Lord. But you thought or you did them without so much as blushing. The way you talked to that coworker or gossiped about them, the way you thought about that in-law, or the jealousy you had of someone who did something better than you, the anger you had at your kids, that was over the line. That was not godly. And you realize the Lord is searching you, and there is sin in your life. And so you need to get rid of it. Josh, in his talk, recommended this is where the spiritual disciplines come in, right? It was silence, solitude, prayer, fasting. And the Lord will help bring to mind the things, the sin in your life that, that you need to get rid of, that you need to throw off, that aren't helping the marathon of faith race that you are in. But then there are other things that maybe aren't sin, but you know good and well that they are extra weight in your marathon of faith. We all struggle with this. But have you ever tried doing less screen time with your phone? So we're trying to do this with our kids this summer. I have a screen-free summer. Why is there no rejoicing from the front row here? A screen-free summer, except for the weekends, Friday, Saturday. There's a little bit of leniency there. But a screen-free summer. And so I'm trying to practice it in my own life to not do the doom scrolling myself, right? And so I'm going through this, and I'm trying to do the less of this. But I catch myself the other night, just out of habit, I am doom scrolling, and I can't get out of it. And so here's what I have to do now when I doom scroll. If I have to get out of doom scrolling, here's what I do. I just go. I did that the other day because that's the only way I can get out of it, and my kids just laughed. They thought this guy's lost bonkers, but Priscilla heard it, and she's doing it now too, so it's good to use. I want to ask you this question, though. When is the last time that you were doom scrolling, or that you were even scrolling for just an hour on your phone, and afterwards you said, oh, I just feel so much closer to the Lord now? I'll answer for you. Never. You have never said that. It's not necessarily sin, right? But it's not helping you grow closer to God either. There's a book my wife and I have been reading, trying to grow in our parenting skills. Yes, we try to do this on occasion to be better. I know it's surprising, at least to my kids. It's called Habits of the Household by Justin Whitmore Early. And there's a section on waking habits, what you do when you wake up. And when you first wake up, what is the first thing that you reach for oftentimes? Is it not that device, that phone? And he says, you reach for the phone, and here is what this phone is telling you. He writes that when we do this, we see the strange half-reflections of our own fears in the morning news. We see the hazy visions of who we wish we were as we scroll social media. And we see the refractions of our ambitions and worries in work emails and task lists. He writes, going to God first, to the Scriptures, to tell us who we are for the first part of our day, for the first part of our morning, to hear His voice of love first, to tell us who we are, is a radical habit of your household that may be the best thing you have ever done to change your life. The Word of God is true. The Word of God is right about us. The Word of God speaks to us. It pierces our hearts. It reveals things about us, and ultimately it changes us because it's all about the one that we are supposed to be focused on and following. And this is the last point of today's lesson. You see, we need a greater focus, and we need to look to others in their example of faith. We need to look at ourselves inwardly and get rid of that sin and the things that hinder us from our faith race. But finally, we need a greater focus, which is a cure for weariness, by looking at Jesus, remaining focused on the author and perfecter of our faith. Like I said earlier, I got to take a long road trip home with Liam this past week. And I got to say, I think guys are different than girls in a long road trip in a car. Girls, if you've ever hiked at least with ladies, it is like, we go on hiking every Thursday up Green Mountain with Tim and Mary and their kids, and the guys are hanging back and we're talking, but the girls, they're up ahead. They don't even know they're walking, I don't think. They don't even know they're going uphill because and so we're talking, right? But, as we're driving home, and it's like 13 hours of these legs that we're doing, right? 13 hours each day, just a couple of days. And you know what? for guys, we don't have to say anything, and we are fine. I know Liam loves me. He knows I love him. We mainly speak in grunts. Food? Yeah. Chick-fil-A? Yeah. Okay, let's go. So on our long road trip, there was time for me to listen to books. And so I listened to a book. It was called Patton's Prayer. It's really about the Battle of the Bulge, which was really the last major German offensive that they tried to break through the Allied troops in Bastogne. They were going there to Bastogne, and the Allies occupied it, but they didn't have enough people there to defend it. And so Patton is trying to get the 3rd Battalion up in time in order to defend it and to thwart the attack. You know, the Germans thought if we occupy this, we can organize a peace treaty and all that kind of stuff. But as Patton was trying to drive the 3rd Battalion up, they encountered horrible, terrible weather. This happened mainly between December and January, and the rains just never, ever stopped. They were constant, and so people, all the troops, he said, had trench foot. You know, they all were just sopping wet. Nobody could keep their socks wet. Even if they tried, they get wet again. And they were trying to get through to Bastogne quick, but the weather was holding them back. And then eventually it started snowing, and they were snowflakes the size of silver dollars. And Patton's like, I could have do more if it wasn't for this blasted weather. And so he calls in his chaplain James H. O'Neill, and he says to the chaplain, he says, write me a prayer for this weather. And the chaplain's like, okay, I'll do that. And so he writes this prayer for the weather. He shows it to Patton. Patton says, I love it. He loves it so much that he actually orders for there to be 250,000 of these prayer cards for the weather to be sent out to the troops. Afterward, Patton calls in O'Neill and he says, I want to talk about this prayer thing. And he says, how many people do you think are praying? And O'Neill said, I think every man prays when there's battle, but in between times, the dull times, the lull times, I don't think anybody's really praying. And so Patton said, tell them they need to pray constantly, all the time, or they will break. And so O'Neill returned to his quarters, and he issued this directive, and he sent it with Patton's name on it to be distributed to the 3rd Army's 486 chaplains, and that included more than 20 divisions. And here's what it said. All these guys who are pushing forward in the rain and the snow, they're tired. They're being woken up at 3 a.m., 2 a.m., like they think they get to rest. No, we got to keep going to Bastogne. And he said, this is what I want you to focus on. And here it is. Pray when driving, pray when fighting, and pray alone. Pray with others, pray by night, and pray by day. Pray for the cessation of immoderate rains. Pray for victory, and pray for peace. And it's almost unbelievable. Not immediately, but at just the right time, on December 23rd, 1944, the weather changed, and blue skies appeared, and the air support was finally able to get in and help the Army. And I tell you that story to say we all need air support. Let me ask you this. What do you do when you are weary in your faith and the storms of life are pouring down on you and you are surrounded by the enemy? The Hebrew writer says you don't focus on those circumstances. You look to a greater focus. Hebrews 12, 2-3. This is our last verse of this. He says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So this lesson is really a conclusion of a couple of series that we put together. Heroes in the Hall of Faith and the book of Hebrews that we started in January, called Jesus is Greater. And really, the Hebrew author is saying here, the greatest hero in the Hall of Faith is Jesus Christ. That's who the author concludes with as the hero who we should focus on the most. Yes, there's Abraham, and there's Moses, and there's Jacob, and there's Joseph, and there's Rahab, and Samson, and David, and Elijah. But the greatest example of them all is Jesus Christ, who by faith, he scorned the shame of the cross, and for who the joy of seeing all those who would believe in what he did for us be at right odds with God, in a right relationship with God, in heaven with him. He went to the cross for us and endured great opposition from sinners for us. Look to him and focus on him so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. There is no better example of faith than Jesus. He is our greatest focus because he didn't come to escape the world. He came to live in the world, and he came to face and experience the suffering of the world as God, just like we do. Some people say, and they ask, why is there so much suffering in the world? And that's a really great question. I don't really have a best answer, but one answer I do have is, I don't know what the answer is, but I know what the answer is not. The answer is not that God does not care, because God sent his only Son in human form to suffer with us and for us. Look to him. Look to him. The life of a follower of Jesus, it can be thrilling, but it also can be very, very exhausting. And to make it to the end of our race, we have got to get a greater focus. And that focus is Jesus Christ. I'll close with one more image. This is the image of Luka Pibernik. He, for a long time, was the most popular Luka in Slovenia because he's a Slovenia Slavic. What is the word there? What? Slovakian, thank you. He is a Slovakian cyclist. Say that 5 times fast, okay? Thank you. Well, he was the most popular Luka in Slovenia. He's still very famous, but he's actually more famous for this picture right here. He's holding out his hands in victory, and he's doing this after 3.5 hours of cycling as fast as he can. The problem is he crossed that finish line, but it's actually laps. There was one more lap in the race. He thought he was finished, but he finished too soon. He let up too soon. And so he was exhausted and spent, and he wound up 148th place. And my point, again, in showing you that, is to finish the race is what's important. And I don't want you to let up too soon. Don't let up too soon. Every one of us needs help to finish our race of faith. Every single one of us. So keep focused on Jesus, because he's the one that can help you finish your race. If you like prayer this morning, we'd like to pray with you in room 9. We'll have our prayer team there for you. Our elders are always here. They'll be in the front and the back to pray with you. If you would like to place your faith in Jesus for the first time, we offer that this morning. Whatever your need may be, please come while we stand and sing this closing song. Please come.